this is my prediction for the strength of each Tera type in Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. Now, I won't have anything lower than C tier on this speculative tier list, because there are scenarios where every one of these Tera typings would be useful to have. So for that reason, I don't think anything is lower than C tier as far as like viability. I think they will all be viable. It's just some are going to be more consistent than others and are going to have additional effects that you can play into that will just make them better choices overall. So let's start with bug type. Bug type is probably going to be the lowest on the list, C tier. Not a great offensive typing, not even that good of a defensive typing. Doesn't provide any immunities or bonuses in weather. It's just bug type. This is probably the least useful of all the Tera types. Although if you have, say, Golisopod and you want a stronger first impressions, the bug Tera type would give you that, and that first impressions would be hitting really hard, but that's about all you're getting out of it, and for that reason it'll sit on the bottom. Next is dark type, and dark type is on the top. We've seen in Sword and Shield a lot of competitive teams will have 2 dark types in there, and that's because dark is just such a good typing to have. You get psychic type immunity, which is a check to expanding force spam, and you also have prankster immunity. So if you have like a trick room setter and you predict a prankster taunt is going to go into it, you could just turn it into a dark type so it would be immune to that prankster taunt, and you could also use this for thunder waves and whatever. It's a great bonus to play into. And defensively, the typing's not that bad. One of your weaknesses is bug, which is one of the worst typings out there. So you're pretty much only weak to fighting and fairy. The limited amount of weaknesses combined with this typing has no immunities offensively, prankster immunity and psychic immunity. It's a great typing to have in the back pocket as like an out for a very specific use case, but also just to negate certain effects in general. But seeing how popular dark type is for support Pokemon, I think it's going to be the choice for a lot of supportive Pokemon. So next up we have Dragon, and I'm going to put Dragon in B tier. Offensively, Dragon is not great. You only have super effective on yourself, but this does have a good defensive spread, and depending on the type of team you're going up against, this could be very useful to have. I definitely would not put it any higher than B though, because I still think it is a bit situational compared to what is going to be in A and S tier. Next is electric type, and I really want to put this in B instead of A. I know that it only has one weakness, which is ground, and pairing this with a levitate user, you essentially have no weaknesses. But this typing cannot hit ground types, similar to how Dragon cannot hit fairy. And there are multiple abilities like Motor Drive, Volt Absorb, Lightning Rod that are all immune to electric type moves. So while defensively, I think this is quite strong. Offensively, it's not the most consistent option out there, though I do think it would be a little bit better than Dragon for a lot of scenarios. Next is Fairy type, and this is going to be a bit odd, but I'm actually going to put Fairy in A. So you have Dragon immunity, and your weakness spread is one that can be covered by a single typing, because Poison, Fire, and Steel are all weak to ground. So I think that makes Fairy type kind of the safe pick when you want just a consistent typing to switch to. Next up is Fighting. I'm going to put this in B tier. This would probably be in A tier if Ghost typing was not immune to fighting type moves, because offensively, Fighting is great. You have close combat, superpower, high jump kick, a variety of very strong physical moves that Fighting Tera would give you stab on. But I think that also is a bit of a weakness because it is very predictable what Fighting Tera type is going to do, because most good fighting moves are on the physical side and they all kind of act the same. And whenever we get to Ghost type, I will explain a little bit more why I think this would be B tier instead of A. Next we'll go to Fire type, and Fire type is going to be A. Now there is immunity to Fire type moves in the form of Flash Fire, but Fire has a synergy with Weather. It also is fairly decent offensive, and the Weather it synergizes with covers one of its weaknesses, which is Water. And as we have seen in Gen 8, Sun teams are very powerful. I would not put Fire any lower than A because of that. The only reason I'm not going to put it in S is because there are certain ways that you can be immune to Fire. You can also counter its Weather with Rain teams, so very strong but can be dealt with. Next is Flying, and I'm actually going to put Flying in A tier. So my reason for this, you have immunity to ground, which ground is a very strong offensive typing, so having immunity from that is great. It also resists fighting, another quite offensive typing. But with flying types, your Pokemon are no longer on the ground, so you are not affected by terrain. And I think there are some scenarios where that could actually be very useful to have access to. It could be very useful to negate that effect, although there are also instances where it could hurt you more than help you. So I think that benefit is a bit more team dependent, but there's also a lot of usefulness to that plus the ground immunity, which is just very nice to have. have. Next is Ghost, and I'm going to put Ghost in A tier as well. So Ghost has 2 immunities, normal and fighting, making it an excellent defensive typing to switch into. Now, the offense is not particularly great on Ghost, but I believe it makes a good check to fighting, keeping it from being just unreasonably strong. And so this is probably one of the best defensive Tera types that you can get. And the reason I won't put it any higher is because normal is immune to Ghost type moves, so its offense is actually not great, but defensively it is very good. Now, next up is Grass, and Grass is A tier. You have synergy with Grassy Terrain, which will boost the power of your attacks. The offensive and defensive spread of Grass is not great. It's about that of Bug, but the terrain boost does help a good bit. There's also some pretty strong grass type moves, such as Grassy Glide, that also benefit from Grassy Terrain. And this typing has immunity to powder moves, which is a big benefit because Amoonguss is always very common in any meta that it's in. So having something being able to switch to Grass Tera type, you can actually check your opponent's Amoonguss to where it's basically useless and will not be able to spore or redirect with Rage Powder, a Pokemon that switches to a grass type. Having access to that, I think, is what makes Grass quite strong in a competitive setting. Next up is Ground, a very offensive. Now, Ground is immune to electric, but Flying is also immune to ground, so there is kind of that. Even with Flying types being immune to ground, Ground is still a very good offensive typing. And there are also some very strong ground type moves, such as Earthquake, which paired with Tera type ground, and if you have a support right next to it that is a flying type so it won't get hit by the ground type attacks, you could just sweep an entire team with Earthquake. Like, it's definitely possible. So I think because of the strong offense of this, while also having decent defense, it's not the greatest defensive spread, but it's not the worst either. I think this is a solid choice and should definitely be worth considering. Next is Ice, and Ice is actually going to be B tier here. Now, Ice can hit everything. There's nothing that is immune to Ice, but Ice has a terrible defensive spread. So you're taking quite a risk terastallizing something into an Ice type. So it is a typing that really can only be used offensively, which if you predict wrong, then you have something that is now weak to fighting, rock, steel, and fire, which is not a defensive spread that you want your main sweeper to have. I actually think Ice in this gen is going to be much better suited as a base typing rather than a terastallized typing. And Ice might actually be the best base typing to have, because when you terastallize, you'll still keep the Ice type stab, but you can choose what defensive spreads you want to have access to. So it'll be good in the format, just not as a Tera type, though it is better than Bug, so that's why I'm putting it in B tier. Next is Normal. I think that goes in B. It does have an immunity. You know, Ghost types can't hit it, but it cannot hit Ghost types. Defensively, it's fine. Offensively, it's not great, but Normal does have access to some pretty good moves. And if you want to make, say, a strong Guts Facade build, you can have Normal Tera type on it and have even stronger facades. So something like Conkeldurr could actually benefit from that. So I think Normal type is fine. It's not anything special, but there's really nothing wrong with it too, just because there's a lot of good Normal type moves, even if they don't have any super effectives on anything. It is also only resisted by 2 typings and only 1 immunity. Something with Scrappy actually could work quite well with the Normal Tera type, so that might be something to consider. Next is Poison. Poison's not a great typing to switch to, because you cannot hit steel types. You're weak to ground, and with Ghost being one of the best defensive typings to switch to, Poison just doesn't have much of a point. Now, it does give you super effective onto Fairy, which depending on the scenario could actually be very useful to have, but I think there are better typings to switch into to deal with Fairy. So kind of just in the Bug tier where, yes, there are scenarios where you could pull it off. There's just not very many. Next is Psychic, and Psychic is going to go into A tier. Now, it cannot hit dark types, but there are not a lot of things that actually resist Psychic. It's just Psychic and Steel. Combine that with the terrain boost that will boost the power of your Psychic type attacks by 50%, and combined with one of the best offensive spread moves in the game, Expanding Force. Psychic will definitely have a point, and if your team does not have a check for Psychic, a strong Psychic type wall breaker could sweep your entire team with just Expanding Force, which is probably why Dark type is so popular. because otherwise Psychic would be kind of out of control if you didn't have access to a Dark type to slow it down. So yeah, I think Psychic type's gonna be pretty good. Next is Rock, and I'm gonna put Rock in B tier. Now, it does have Weather synergy, so you get higher special defense and Sandstorm. However, it is not a very good typing defensively, and I think that is really what keeps it from being better than these, because it doesn't have enough benefit from its weather boost that I think it's better than any of the typings above. Now, it is pretty good offensively. I think the less than stellar defense is enough to put it in B tier. Kind of has the Ice type problem, but I do actually think it's a little bit better than Ice type as a Tera typing. Next up is Steel, and I'm actually going to put Steel in A tier. It does have poison immunity, though it is weak to ground, fire, and fighting. It resists a lot of typings, and that just gives it a lot of utility. And two of the typings that it is weak to, you can negate with an ability. You can have Levitate to cover ground, or you could put this on a Flash Fire Pokemon to cover fire. So I think this is a great choice. Just make sure that your opponent doesn't have a lot of answers to Steel in their team before doing this. And last is Water. Water is also A tier, and that is because of Rain. Rain is quite a strong weather. It's not quite as good as Fire typically, but it is still very good, and it will always be a check to Fire and Sun teams. Water is also a good defensive typing. It doesn't have a lot of weaknesses, and its offense is okay. There are a few abilities that will grant immunity to water type moves, but it's not quite as bad as, say, electric. So I do think this has quite a bit of utility, as water always does. Water's just a solid typing in general to go for. And just a quick side note, because I forgot to mention, I know electric type does synergize with electric terrain. The thing is, the main gimmick that I see brought up with electric type involves putting it with a Levitate user so that you can have no weaknesses. And the thing is, doing that means you don't get a bonus from electric terrain. So you kind of have to pick one over the other. You don't have access to all the advantages of the typing to make the most of it. So for that reason, it's going to be kept in B tier and not go any higher. Now, please keep in mind, this is all just a prediction. It is very likely some of these are actually not as strong as I've placed them, though I am pretty confident that Dark type is S tier. It's just the best typing for support Pokemon to have. And all the ones in A tier are going to be very strong. You're going to probably see them a good bit. And I do predict that the ones I have in B tier are going to be a fair bit less common, though they will still have a point in very specific matchups. You might actually see a lot of electric. It's just not going to have that great of a benefit as people might seem to indicate that it will. And then C tier, you probably will not see poison and bug used a lot at all. Though you could be surprised by a Tera bug boosted first impressions.